I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about psilocybin for mental health treatment. This is an update of a video I released in 2022 with more current information. And as usual, I will start with the take-home message. So the take-home message is that psilocybin has been used for millennium in spiritual and hallucinogenic experiences. Works on serotonin 2A receptors, activating them. And a number of studies have shown robust effects for helping with depression, death-related fears around a cancer diagnosis, and alcohol abuse. And it's being investigated in a wider range of treatment conditions. Single doses appear to have long-term impact, but it's not completely clear how well the clinical research is going to translate into the real world, since there's very likely to be substantial differences between how these studies have been conducted. They have been of small size, and how people in the real world will use them. So a recent survey indicated that more than 134 different clinical trials for using psilocybin have been registered. Only 2 of those have reached phase 3, which is the final stage for drug development and approval by the FDA. And a recent different meta-analysis found a little more than 21 randomly controlled trials using psilocybin to treat depression, substance abuse, OCD, cancer diagnosis, anorexia. There were a total of just 800 subjects. So it's a decent number of trials. It's not a particularly large number of subjects. So that's averaging less than 40 subjects a trial. One of the studies that's been done, it's the 2022 study on treatment for substance abuse. It is still the second largest study in psilocybin that's been published. It was conducted on 2 locations at the University of New Mexico and NYU. And they recruited 95 subjects. All these subjects had a history of problematic drinking. In the last month, they had to have at least 5 days of heavy drinking. They averaged 15 years of alcohol abuse problems. And the group was divided into 2 halves, and it was double blind, so subjects did not know which treatment they were assigned to. Investigators did not know which treatment the subjects were assigned to, and they were given either psilocybin or diphenhydramine. Diphenhydramine was thought to be an active placebo, so having some effects on the mind or body rather than just a completely inert pill to hopefully mask who was getting what. So the design of the study was a 12 weeks of psychotherapy study. So each week there's a psychotherapy session. Therapy was directed at substance abuse, decreasing, and using motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. After 4 one-week sessions of the psychotherapy, there was a day-long session of dosing, either with psilocybin or placebo. 4 more weeks of psychotherapy, and then at week 8, there was a second dose, and they received the same substance they received the first time, either the same dose or a higher dose if they had not had maximal effects. And then there were 4 more weeks of psychotherapy, and they actually followed group out for 36 weeks after the start of the study. So more than half a year after the treatment with psilocybin. So what did they find? At week 4, so this was day of or just before they were treated with either psilocybin or diphenhydramine, both groups of patients, subjects, had markedly decreased their drinking, So whether it was days of heavy drinking or days of drinking, all variables, and I'm averaging sort of across them, drinking was pretty much cut in half in a 4-week time. That's a pretty good result. So it showed that psychotherapy was already helping. Then if you looked at what happened subsequent to the drug treatment, time point 4 weeks in and time point 8 weeks in, diphenhydramine group, Benadryl group maintained that initial 4 weeks of improvement. So that itself is okay. But the psilocybin group showed a further cutting in half again the number of problematic drinking days, the amount consumed. So they were down to a quarter of their initial use, which is a pretty substantial effect in a substance abuse trial. And again, that abstinence or decreased use found to persist through at least half a year. Now, objections to this study, objections are reasons it may not translate well. This group of individuals is mostly white, well-educated. It was conducted during COVID. So one thing that curtailed their ability to recruit new subjects for the study, so it was smaller than they intended. But again, the results were statistically significant. And COVID cuts two ways because that was a time period when most people were quite stressed out. And we know overall substance use rates were going up substantially. So the fact that this group, problem drinkers, actually decreased further during a time of COVID is a fairly positive and strong, convincing, and again, idiosyncratic to this trial. About 40% of the people in the psilocybin group did have headaches. There was also notable incidences of nausea, anxiety, short-term increases in blood pressure. The only severe side effects were actually in the placebo group, and they were related to continuing heavy drinking, such as gastrointestinal bleeding. And when they asked individuals could they tell which substance they had received 4 weeks in, 93% accurately predicting what they had received. And when they did that again after the second dosing at 8 weeks in, 97% of individuals correctly guessed. So we have safety data from two different sources. One is studies like this one, which are highly controlled group of subjects, screened for not being suicidal, not having a whole host of other conditions. So carefully selected, not representative of the general population, given carefully monitored dosing, given extensive therapy before, during, and after in many cases. And in studies like that, rates of serious side effects are extremely low. On the other hand, there's also some real-world data population from poison control centers and others looking at people who have taken psilocybin. And the difficulty there is that many times there's contamination from two different uses. One is intentional multi-use, many people using psilocybin at a rave or some other event, maybe using alcohol, other substances as well. And two is that the product themselves, they may identify that they took magic mushrooms, but might have been laced with PCP. It might have had other contaminants. So though some serious side effects have been associated with psilocybin in the world at large, it's difficult to rule out how many of those may have been contaminants or other substances mixed in. So in terms of just general overall safety, how much of this stuff can you chow down or swallow before it's going to kill you, which is called the therapeutic index. Psilocybin is very safe. So there's some medications like lithium that are pretty high risk. So if taking 10 days worth of lithium is close to the LD50. Half the people may die from that dose. Half would survive, some with injuries. Most of our antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, have at least 100 to 1 therapeutic lethality index. So you'd have to take more than 3 months worth of Prozac, for example, for it to be likely to kill you, 50-50 odds. Psilocybin is even safer than that, where the therapeutic to lethal index is at least 1,000 to 1. So that makes it very safe in terms of overdose. In the population at large, there have been a handful, tiny number of cases of heart attacks or other lethal cardiovascular problems. Those have not been detected in any of the controlled studies. Whether that's contamination or very rare bad effects. In EEGs and other studies, it does not seem that psilocybin has a high risk for causing arrhythmias or problems there. One question that's come up with many of the hallucinogenic drugs is the risk of long-term valvular fibrosis and problems over time, particularly with multiple doses. Valvular damage has been tightly associated with binding to the serotonin 2B receptor. Psilocybin, for its hallucinogenic effects and as far as we know, its therapeutic effects, involves binding to the serotonin 2A receptor. And most studies indicate that psilocybin either has no binding to the 2B receptor, so it's completely safe, or binding that is at least 100 or 1,000-fold weaker than to its 2A serotonin. So up to a quarter of people on psilocybin, even in the controlled setting, have a bad trip or some people want to recall that challenging experience and or panic attacks afterwards or during. And even labeling it a bad trip, it should be highlighted. Some people think that that's a particularly useful type of experience to have therapeutically, that it can teach someone how to overcome struggling with difficult, big issues. So it's a known aspect, whether it's actually a bad side effect or an incidental one, it can be experienced as difficult. Nausea is common. The drugs that affect serotonin fairly commonly have gastrointestinal effects. No long-term major gastrointestinal issues have been linked with psilocybin. Psilocybin has been linked extremely rarely. There are a handful of cases of mania or psychosis that persisted for long periods of time. That hasn't showed up in the controlled studies and again seems to be quite rare. And it's unknown how commonly is something called what we used to call flashbacks and now we call hallucinogen persisting perception disorders. So that's recurrence either in the short run or in the longer run of hallucinatory experience creeping in or recurring without being welcomed or without redosing of the medication. When I was growing up in the 60s, late 60s, all the health education books and the health education taught in schools was these were horrible, bad, dangerous drugs, the hallucinogens, because everyone would be flipping out, everyone would be hallucinating, everyone would be thinking they could fly and jumping out of buildings. You shouldn't do this. They were highly dangerous. One of the things to be aware of is that most of the time people are having a psilocybin-induced trip. They are aware they're hallucinating. They are aware they're seeing colors, shapes, things that aren't there. They are aware that that is not reality. So not that it never happens, but the likelihood of trying to fly or do other things is fairly remote because people generally retain some ability to know that they are hallucinating. Vulnerability is another issue. So clearly part of the state that psilocybin induces is being more open to other experiences. You're working intensely under altered cognitive abilities with individuals. So in at least one of the more recent hallucinogen studies, there was one boundary violation of inappropriate sexual contact between a therapist and a patient. And again, these are tightly controlled studies so far. And if this is used and employed much more widely, there's greater potential for therapists inappropriately taking advantage of patients in this setting. A little bit more about psilocybin, how it works, what it is. So there are more than 200 varieties of mushrooms that make this psilocybin substance. About half of them are in the genus Psilocybes, but many other types of mushrooms can produce a psilocybin product. And unlike some of our other hallucinogen and other plant-based products that are used in medicine, folk medicine, psilocybin is actually found in both the Americas and in Europe. It seems to have been independently discovered in both regions of the world and used for thousands of years for spiritual and hallucinogenic experiences. One thing to be aware of is there is considerable variation in the amount of psilocybin in a given piece of mushroom. So it's not just the species of mushroom. It's not just how old the mushroom is, not just where it's grown. And that factor can be as big as 100-fold differences. So just, I'm only taking a little bit of mushroom, might be 100 times more potent than you're aware of. All the studies that I've referred to have been done with synthetically created the exact same psilocybin molecule. Precise dosing is known. There is a lot of variability among the studies as to what the dose is used. So psilocybin itself is not psychoactive. It's psilocin, which is a derivative of psilocybin that is quickly converted to. Psilocin has strong and potent effects as acting upon activating the serotonin 2A receptor. Unlike some of the other serotonin-based hallucinogens like LSD, which also directly boosts dopamine, psilocin doesn't directly boost it, but because there are interactions between dopamine and serotonin systems, there is some indirect dopamine activation. Topic of focus is how activation of the 2A serotonin receptor activates both limbic systems and medial prefrontal cortex systems and increases synaptogenesis. So new synapses are being made, new connections are being made. Some of those seem to persist into time, so the brain is actually being rewired. Some people think it's useful to view these drugs as reopening a critical period for adaptability. There are certain periods of time when the brain is able to learn or wire itself to adapt to what environment is going on. But at the end of the critical period, the ability to rewire seems to be lost. So if you lose one eyeball really early in life, then part of the brain is able to remap readily to adapt to that. Certain changes later in life, there's less adaptability. And anyway, the thought is that the hallucinogens that work on the 2A may be reopening that critical period. So changes that are hard to adapt or hard to make in adult life can be happening again. There is some interesting research looking at how do we measure those synaptogenesis without slicing up in people's brains. So there are approaches using synaptic vessel protein 2A density, which can be detected by PET scans in live people. And there are studies going forward that are looking at how psilocybin and other hallucinogens may be affecting neuroplasticity. So one issue is whether this neuroplasticity can be separated from the hallucinogenic effects. Some people argue that hallucinogenic effect is an essential part of what's going on, and others argue that it can be separable, that you can have changes in how the brain is being rewired, and that the hallucination, the trip, is just a epiphenomenon on top of that. I would argue neither side has presented a wealth of definitive, consistent research in terms of the changes in personality that have been detected, and this is across multiple studies. The 5 domains of personality, 3 of them seem to be fairly consistently altered. So there's a reduction in neuroticism, and the neuroticism deduction seems to happen through decreases in depression, decreases in vulnerability, decreases in impassiveness, increase in the dimension of extroversion, or how outgoing someone is. There's an increase in the dimension of openness, and particularly openness to feelings and openness to fantasy. And the net result is people seem to be, after a single dose, often seem to be more receptive, empathetic, open to new experiences, open to connections with nature and the rest of the world. In the 60s, these drugs were being widely used both in therapeutic clinics and in the general population, the hippie drug use population. Sandoz, one of the most major drug company in Basel, Switzerland, one of the more conservative countries in terms of some of these social factors. Sandoz was manufacturing psilocybin throughout the 60s and making it available to therapists and patients in therapy. In the US in 1970, under part of Nixon's Law and Order campaign that was intended to crack down on subversive hippies and the peace love movement, psilocybin and many other psychoactive substances were banned. They were put under Schedule 1, which meant they had no medical value and could not be used in any form or way. It was a whole generation later, during the Clinton administration in the 1990s, there was finally some opening to research with hallucinogens and other psychedelic substances, but it wasn't until 2004 that the first clinical trial was approved. So the studies that have been approved in that time are, one, tightly regulated. So the researchers, because they don't want the whole movement to be shut down again, the patients that are recruited are highly selected. So most studies exclude suicidality, other substance abuse, other mental health conditions. So they're looking only at depression or only at substance abuse or only at OCD. Treatment teams are highly monitored and highly trained so that they are presenting both the psychotherapy and the information about the substance in the same way. Fairly, in terms of who is being recruited to these trials, people who are white, well-educated, above average income are overrepresented in the trials. And maybe even more worrisomely, subjects that are being recruited are probably more open, so they're already high and above average on that openness variable, whether they're winding up in the treatment group or the placebo group. That may also be skewing results and make it not as clear how a the general population may respond to these substances. In 2018, the FDA declared that psilocybin was a breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression. They expanded that as a breakthrough treatment for depression in 2019. Breakthrough status is supposed to facilitate the approval of more studies so it can be brought to market. And it was based on preliminary studies indicating a high likelihood that there was therapeutic potential. At the federal level, psilocybin is still categorized as substance one, so it's still criminal to possess it or to use it, although several states have decriminalized it, starting with Oregon in 2020, Colorado in 2022. California a couple of times has refused to decriminalize it, but local communities, Oakland, Santa Cruz, others have decriminalized it. Decriminalize it just means that they declare it's a low priority for arrest or prosecution. That does not stop federal officers in those states from pursuing people. Studies to date have all been fairly consistently with therapeutic doses of psilocybin, showing benefits for depression, benefits for substance abuse reduction, benefits for OCD, benefits for existential anxiety around receiving a serious cancer diagnosis. A handful of studies that have been less clear-cut or less convincing in terms of results have been microdosing. Microdosing itself is an imprecise term and usually implies a dose low enough not to induce any hallucinatory experiences or mind-altering experiences. In terms of this whole population of studies, one huge problem is finding and finding adequate placebos. So again, as in the study I cited, upwards of 90% of people, high 90s, can usually tell whether they got the treatment psilocybin or something else, even if we're trying to use an active placebo that might have some mind-altering and cause headaches. Overlaps with the idea of expectation effects. Most of the people who were in these studies had the expectation, some previous experience with mind-altering substances, that the psilocybin is going to work, it's going to be effective, and also, therefore, that if they get the placebo, it's not going to help them. That can make the results look more positive or more encouraging than they might be in the real world. There's also been a large variety, so we haven't yet settled on a standardized dosage of psilocybin, either as a absolute number of milligrams or correlating it in the milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So there's a large variety in the dosing protocols, and there's an even larger variety in therapy protocols. So how much preparation ahead of time is important, how much is essential, how much is irrelevant, supportive therapy, guidance, direction during dosing of the medication, psilocybin, vary somewhat, and then how much follow-up, how much incorporation. Again, some people believe that the therapy is an intrinsic, essential part of this whole treatment. Others are thinking that it's primarily the drug doing its effects, and we're just having this therapy because the government's requiring that we have the therapy until we can prove that it's not necessary, even though there's, again, more than 130 studies that have been planned and approved. Of the 20 plus random controlled studies, most of the 20 are randomly controlled in mental health conditions. They've entailed less than 800 subjects. That's not particularly large. For the depression studies, some of them required failure of past antidepressants. So for treatment-resistant depression and past antidepressant use may well modify serotonin systems and may give a different. People who've had previous antidepressants may respond differently to these drugs than others. There's a tiny bit of data, and people often ask this as to whether concurrent, so using a conventional, particularly serotonin reuptake inhibitor together with psilocybin, blocks its effects. Preliminary data suggests that it makes for somewhat less intense or less frequent hallucinatory experiences, but it doesn't seem to interfere with the benefits in terms of antidepressant effects. But again, then that might be the that it's a cumulative antidepressant effect. We still don't know, is hallucination necessary or is it a side effect? Comparisons have been made to ketamine for years. It was claimed having a dissociative effect with ketamine was essential for having an antidepressant effect. At least a few studies have pretty clearly shown many individuals at a lower dose of ketamine where they're not out of touch with reality do have an antidepressant effect. And yet there are still, you can go on the web, find clinic directors who say, we dose it up until they start having a dissociative experience, and then we know they're going to have an antidepressant one. Again, antidepressant with ketamine does seem to occur at a lower level than the dissociation. How true that is for psilocybin is not clear. And again, it's highly relevant to the topic of microdosing. Whether the psychotherapy component is necessary to integrate or work through the hallucination, or whether it's superfluous, is open to question. Preliminary studies are so clear-cut that in a controlled situation, psilocybin works for substance abuse disorders, it works for depression, it probably works for a broader range of anxiety and mood disorders. Increasingly, people will be using it, and whether we're seeing the same rate of success and whether we wind up seeing more problems, that remains to be seen where the balance will be. That's all for today. Stay healthy, stay happy.